I'm going to talk about these two bucks for a second here. A big target buck, call him a 9-point from Coon Valley, and then Kermit here on the top from Minnesota here on the property. And the way we're able to target these bucks to a high percentage of the time, and I would say over a 10-year period, then these bucks we're trying to focus on, we would actually harvest, shoot, you know, have an opportunity at about 80% of the time. And people say, well, that's impossible, because it goes back to, if you watch any kind of buck studies and free-ranging bucks on big scientific studies, they're very misleading, because they'll say a buck has a 3-mile home range. Well, what does that really mean? On big, open, corporate or public lands, or property sizes of 1,000 to 2,000 acres or more, bucks are going to move a long ways on a daily basis. They're going to be happy because of all the cover, big open surroundings, and probably unmanaged forests. And we're going to go through these 5 points. They're used to traveling a very long ways within not only their daylight movements, but their overall movements. And then you get into that 3-mile home range. So if that was the case, it's very disheartening for a 40-acre parcel to think that you can hold bucks or target them on a daily basis. These two bucks right here lived the majority of their daylight within a small 200 to 400 yard window. And what's really cool about that is, if you manage this way in the ways I'm going to talk about, then you can really shrink the daylight movements and overall movements of mature bucks. And I've seen that happen over and over again. So we're going to set these two racks to the side here. Oh boy, we can fix that. First one, you look at a 1,000-acre parcel right here. Big, broad, open parcel. And it would be a typical public land holding. It would be the typical property that a study is completed on for mature buck movements. Again, those studies are accurate for the type of habitat there is. They're not accurate as it relates to your small parcel and your ability to create high quality habitat improvements and shrink that movement. So we look at a 1,000-acre parcel like this. No matter where a buck is located, they're traveling in and out of that parcel, even if they like to spend a lot of time of their time, even their hunting season time, in this location right here. Because food is random, let's say food's out here, covers here, maybe there's a quality food source down here. Because it's open, there's no high quality food plots that last the entire hunting season. In fact, if it was ag land, that ag land's always changing, being plowed under, picked early, combined early, harvested, planted. There's such a variance in the window of what's going on in ag, let alone on big open hardwood areas where food and cover can always be changing. So in an area like this, that 1,000 acres becomes just a travel corridor and a pathway, and not a very big part of a buck's daylight movement, because food and cover is always changing. You know, think big wilderness area, big woods, big open hardwoods. And so deer are traveling greatly. These timber cuttings are critical, because now in that 1,000 acres, let's say they took off this area, big hollow, and there's a cutting in that area. Now you might find that a lot of this deer movement during the daylight, when they need cover, is coming into this area. On private land, if there's food sources somewhere else, now you have the cutting areas, and then they leave for those food sources, which might be still far away. Now in a public land setting, big open corporate land, then you'll find that cutting in the browse that's created by that. Clear cuts can create about 1,000 pounds of forage per acre per year. Then you find that deer might actually gravitate to that cutting area during the fall, and when they want that high quality browse, which in most areas in the upper Midwest, north half of the country, would really slant in and start to really take a good foothold in November, December, January, February, March, where they need that all winter long. So you can see how just providing a cutting in that corner of the 1,000 acres is going to reduce overall movements by, and you think about does and fawns, they have about 1/5, 1/4 the overall movement and home range that a buck does, maybe even less than that. And so really you're shrinking not only the buck's movement, but of course the doe movements are going to be really tight. Now what if you had another cutting over here? So in this corner, and maybe you had one down here. Now you're really starting to slot in movements where Bucks can actually focus, especially in a public land setting, on different cuttings, meaning you could have more mature bucks, meaning you can pack more deer into one parcel. But you have to do that. Timber cuttings are the first. If you have an open 40 acres of hardwoods, you're really fighting an uphill battle because you have thousands of dollars of dirt work, planting, regeneration to take place before you even can begin to create a solid whitetail and wildlife parcel. That's where you hear some whitetail consultants will say, well, it's going to take 5 years or 10 years. It does not if you start with the right ingredients. So if you start with an upland mix, I know Dylan visits Parcels now quite a bit. His first parcel he visited was in 2017. So he's been going to client properties. I believe he has 8 or 9 scheduled right now around the country. And he flies into the parcels where I'm driving to Parcels. So I think he's going to be in Texas, Oklahoma, New York, Pennsylvania, North Carolina,
Alabama, Missouri, Maryland. The list goes on.
Yeah, and you had some people that want you to go to Montreal.
Yeah.
And when the Canadian borders open, I know you can't wait to go. So Dylan has a ball doing these. We love enjoying and doing these, talking about the plans together. And bottom line is, this works anywhere that a whitetail roams, but you have to cut timber. I know Dylan on one of those Pennsylvania parcels, they had an upland mix. They had bottomland, upland. So they had a lot of different pieces of habitat that went together, and that was a really good one. And I'm not sure on the second one, did you have, that had a bunch of fields and edge?
It was also a very good mix, yeah.
Yeah. Yep. So pretty cool. That makes it easier for us. We can say if you do these things and you change the way you hunt, you're going to make a drastic improvement to your plan within a year. It doesn't take that long when you have the right ingredients. Number 2, so timber cuttings. You get those cuttings in, it produces different layers. It produces a different kind of focus for daylight, especially in bedding areas. And then if you complement that with food, then that helps too. Layers of habitat diversity. So again, going back to that upland mix, that edge, that bottomland, that old growth hardwoods that allows you to define, well, deer aren't here. And then that new growth regeneration that helps define where deer want to browse during the day. Briars, conifers, thickets, ag land mixed in. You can have a lot of diversity, open fields in one location, and that will shrink those movements because, again, not only do deer have food sources and cover options and bedding areas within a tight window on 40 acres, let alone 1,000 acres, but they have more defined food and cover options. They're in that location to help shrink the movement from bedding to feeding every day. And then if you have that many layers of diversity, then you also have a stressor, a low stress environment for deer, where there's separation between deer, there's separation between doe family groups, between young bucks, old bucks, and other old bucks. And so with that separation that the habitat diversity leads to, you can fit more of those mature bucks onto your parcel. Number 3, in order to provide those precision daylight buck movements, you have to reduce the hunting pressure. And that seems obvious, but imagine the impact of hunters going into an open public land setting or an open property, commercial property, or private setting where there's 1,000 to 2,000 acres and it's all open hardwoods. And so that hunting pressure is magnified due to the lack of habitat diversity. And when you have hunting pressure applied to big open parcels, standard timber practices, then your intrusions as a hunter have a much far-reaching, greater level of impact than a property that is diverse, has timber cuttings, and is full of good habitat. So reducing the hunting pressure is so critical in developing a plan. And if the plan is not based on how you can hunt the land, then you're not going to be successful. Because if your habitat improvements invite attraction to a certain location, only be spooked by you when you go hunt the land, then you're better off not making any of these habitat improvements. You're actually hurting the herd more than you're helping the herd. You want to keep the daylight movements between 100 and 500 yards. And what I mean by that is on private land. Now, if you're looking on public land, I've shot bucks that are feeding in one location 3/4 mile from where they bed during the day, and I'm shooting them in their bedding areas. Where, there's deer in the middle of the night around bait piles in the UP of Michigan, for example, or high hunting public land properties or private land properties in southern Ohio, southern Kentucky, northern Illinois, whatever it might be, Missouri, Iowa. Then you're looking at that window of daylight movement that a buck wants to travel in the first place. In northern Ohio, where there's a lack of cover, he might only move 100 yards during daylight for the majority of the entire season. And then, I mean, from bedding area to food source. What that doesn't take into account is their rutting activity. But you might find that a buck may travel 3 miles during the daylight, or 2 miles, or 1 mile, but he never left a 10-acre patch of cover as he was searching for does, pushing out young bucks, making rubs and scrapes, and became active in the pre-rut, rut, and post-rut. And also what you find is if you have a very tight window that you've created of good diversity, lack of hunting, good timber cuttings, diversity of habitat, reducing hunting pressure, you'll find those daylight movements shrink drastically as deer like the low stress atmosphere of being able to plan on this food source, this bedding area, and traveling in between safely during the daylight. Think about it. There's not a lot of locations in whitetail habitat across the entire country where that happens on a daily basis, let alone all hunting season long. Number 5, the camera doesn't lie. I hear people say, you know, about half the bucks we shoot are random bucks. 70% of the bucks, 40% of the bucks, 80, whatever it is a random buck that we never had a picture of. And that's normal. Folks, that is not normal. It's normal for bad whitetail properties. It's normal for properties that are 1,000 acres with no improvements, big open hardwoods, big public land settings, a lot of random bucks then because you might be looking at a buck from 3 miles away. But when you have high quality improvements, when you have timber cuttings, layers of habitat diversity, reduced hunting pressure, daylight movements that you're creating that food and cover to make those deer move in a small pattern every single day, then you find that the mature buck daylight movements and the patterns they create are anything but random. That means that the majority of the bucks that we shoot here in Minnesota, it's our first year coming in here. We bought the land in June. The bucks that we shot were anything but random. We had pictures of them all. We hoped to shoot them in those locations. And when it came down to Kermit and it came down to the big 9 Point in Wisconsin, we knew those bucks were there in those locations. Can't say every single day. We don't know what they do every single day, but the majority of the time during the hunting season, and they were anything but random to actually shoot them, let alone the hunt and going out to a tree and hoping we saw that specific buck on a property that we'd only owned for 6 months. Think about that. It doesn't take 5 years, 10 years, 3 years to make your land good or to get the most out of your hunting land and the buck opportunities in the area. It takes shrinking the overall buck movements by completing these 4 steps. I encourage you to create mock scrapes, use a camera, use a trail camera, and you'll find that not only are bucks rarely random, you'll look at a 10-year period and you'll say, you know what, out of that 10 years, we shot 3 random bucks out of the 35 that we shot overall. It should be less than 10% of your overall bucks that you shoot, and on the best managed properties, you'll find that's less than 5%, especially properties you have a actual history with. And I want you to look at this for a second. You take this 1,000 acres and all these, you create a property that has good cuttings, that has overall good timber management, so you're improving the land, has high quality food sources. You know, on a 40 acres with decent numbers, you want at least 2 to 3 acres. Has good and safe movement to that, so you're encouraging deer to hit this food source after dark. It might include 10, 20, 30, 50 acres, even 100 acres of your neighbors. If you just take a small window of your neighbor's land around here, your neighbors are coming this way to hunt your borders, not the other way. You can take the movements on 1,000 acres and whittle it down to 40 acres. Kind of goes back to what kind of size parcel do you need to hunt and to manage with. The better job you do at reducing your hunting pressure, which is how you hunt, your hunting strategy, providing timber cuttings, layers of habitat diversity, various plantings to change the habitat, and the more you focus on the true movement of the distance that deer are moving from bedding to feeding on a daily basis, then you'll find that this 40 acres done right outcompetes 1,000 acres done poorly. And I found that very few people in the country, when they're managing whitetail properties, especially private landowners that don't have the experience to know otherwise, they're putting a lot of money into habitat improvements. But if you don't manage those improvements within that window that bucks want to move, within the various cuttings that are geared towards whitetails. Could be hinge cutting in some areas, could be complete cutting in areas. A lot of times, like on our property here, it'll be a combination of both. You have to manage the hunting pressure, and then you can create that 40-acre parcel that outcompetes 1,000 nearby and really shrink a home range of a buck. And that's why I say over here, 3-mile home range busting. Don't ever take it for granted that science tells you that this is how far a buck's going to move on a daily basis. Learn how you can shrink that. And not only will you shrink that, if you're providing all those timber cuttings, layers of habitat and those food source to cover movements that are thick in between, you're working on your timber and your type of property so that you have a great diversity. You're going to have lots of different wildlife species to go along with it. And that could be the true test of the best whitetail parcel, is how many actual wildlife species you have on your property and the diversity of those species. Because if you have a great whitetail parcel, you're going to have a lot of different forms of wildlife. And that's enjoyable for anybody that's on your land, whether you're bird watching or looking for rabbits or hunting pheasant, grouse, whatever it might be. You're going to enjoy your property even more. But most of all, your cameras won't lie. You're going to have very few random bucks, and you're going to have a highly precision daylight buck movement that you can provide this fall. And what does that provide ultimately? A great hunt. And I hope you enjoy it. Now, as we transition into habitat season, I hope you've had a chance to check out my web class, How to Design Your Whitetail Parcel. It's on my website, whitetailhabitatsolutions.com. I have a link in the description, and I hope you can find it, check it out, and enjoy it this year.